Blackburn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Dr. Greitens, I want to come to you. General McMaster wrote something that I really like. He pursues the three-prong approach when he's talking about the CCP, co-option, coercion, concealment, in how they pursue military fusion. And I find that so interesting because that is one of the issues that really hits us in the face when we look at how China approaches this. And I know you've done a lot of study on this. So what I'd like for you to do is to lay out your concerns and also your recommendations on how we should proceed as we deal with each prong, knowing that we do not practice civil-military fusion. You know where our Commerce Department ends, and you know where our defense industry begins. So if you would just lay that out and then talk about how that affects our academic and research institutions.
Thank you, Senator. That's a really important question, and I'm happy to try to cover it as much of it as I can, and I'll follow up afterwards.
Let me just say this. If you want to give a highlight and then submit to me for the record, I think that is something that as we look at the NDAA, we need to think this through and have a more thoughtful approach to this. You hear us talking about semiconductors, you hear us talking about AVs and EVs and AI, and there is an integration of every bit of that. So hit the highlights, and then Mr. Pottinger, I have a question I want to come to you on.
Yes, thank you. Let me bracket the question of semiconductors because we've had a little bit of a chance to discuss that already, and I'm happy to follow up with you after the hearing to discuss that. And I'll focus principally on your question about higher education for the moment. I think American higher education is in the midst of a reckoning and a recalibration of its relationships with the People's Republic of China. I would look at 4 different areas in thinking about the challenges that China's role poses for American higher education. First of all is research security. One of the things that you all are considering is an enormous amount of investment in American research, particularly in tech and the sciences. And it's really important that that funding not immediately gets siphoned off via illicit tech transfer.
Yes, and as you're aware, we
China.
have a trial going on in Knoxville, Tennessee this week with a UT professor, and we also have an issue with a Russian spy that somehow became connected to Oak Ridge. So very aware of that. Thank you for mentioning it.
Yes, and thank you for your attention to that issue. I think one of the things that needs to happen is tighter requirements, and I've publicly supported and written about some of these in the past, of disclosure of both funding coming from China or other foreign countries. It's not just a China problem, but the size of the funding is a lot bigger, and talent program participation. I can tell you from having been at 2 American flagship public universities that the disclosure process is not standard across different institutions, and I would support some standardization and some collaboration between the Department of Education, American universities, and other parts of the federal government to ensure that disclosures are more uniform and more complete. Second, I think I would commend some excellent work by Mary Gallagher that I'd be happy to provide to the committee, where she looks at the role of Chinese student and scholars associations. This is less an issue with espionage or tech transfer than it is in the social sciences and for free speech and free inquiry on campus, which is a fundamental value of American society and American higher ed. Her suggestion is that given the nature of the funding and the close coordination between these CSSAs, the shorthand, and some of their relationships with Chinese government entities like consulates in the United States, that it may be appropriate for them to register as foreign agents under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So that's a second recommendation. Third is that I think we need to grapple with the increasing use of what I would call lawfare, meaning lawsuits and sanctions that punish researchers who publish work that is critical of the Chinese Communist Party. And we've seen that recently with researchers and people who've been advocates for human rights in Europe and in North America as well. Much of this will be more of a university level conversation, but I think Congress has a role in setting expectations for the support that will be provided to people if the pressure from the Chinese Communist Party gets brought to bear. The last thing is that I think we have a pipeline problem. In that, during the Cold War, we funded open source translation and we funded the development of a cohort of analysts and experts who really knew the Soviet Union and were reporting in real time about a lot of developments. That pipeline, from my perspective as someone who trains doctoral students and researchers, is too thin. And so I think as we talk about federal funding, and as we look at investments, a relatively small investment in social sciences and open source translation services to build the intellectual base that we need for our long-term competition is going to be an important measure to consider. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Pottinger, I'm going to come to you with a written question pertaining to electric vehicles and the supply chain issues that we face there with electric vehicles. We also see the same thing in pharmaceuticals, but of course we have an administration trying to really incentivize $200 billion into EVs. But what I've learned by talking to some of our researchers is we do not have the necessary support base for that, and I will send that in writing to you.
I'll gladly
Thank you,
respond.
Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Senator Blackburn.